Welcome to Witch Hunt Victim Stories. I'm Josh Hutchinson. During the Salem Witch Trials, Minister George Burroughs was accused of being the leader of the witches in New England and serving as a satanic priest at the witches' sabbaths held in Salem Village in Andover. Himself a former Salem Village minister, he may seem odd choice for this role, but the friction in the village between supporters and detractors of the ministers may have prompted his designation as ringleader, as negative stories about him and especially his treatment of his wives circulated through Salem and beyond. As a Harvard-trained minister, Burroughs occupies a unique position in the history of the witch trials, proving that essentially nobody was safe from accusation and conviction. After he was accused, 4 more ministers would be accused, though none was formally charged. In addition, several family members of ministers were accused: wives, children, siblings, and grandchildren. One factor which led to suspicion against George was his reportedly harsh treatment of his wives, an indicator that he had failed in society's expected role as a husband and leader of a household. Another cause for question was his mysterious strength. He was described as small in stature, but was reported to have performed many feats ordinary men could not. He was also reported to know things he couldn't possibly know, such as what people said about him when he was away. Another critical factor in the allegations against George was that he was somehow not following the Puritan orthodoxy. In fact, some suspected he was a Baptist, or at least had Baptist tendencies. George Burroughs was born in about 1650 in Suffolk, England, where his grandfather had been a rector. George was the son of Nathaniel Burroughs and Rebecca Stiles Burroughs. His family moved to Maryland while he was young. In 1657, his mother moved to Massachusetts and joined the church in Roxbury. His father, meanwhile, traveled the coast as a merchant mariner. George graduated from Harvard in 1670. At Harvard, George was a schoolmate of his future predecessor as Salem Village minister, James Bailey, who was a year ahead of him. There were only 4 men in George's graduating class: George, Ami Ruhama Corlett, Thomas Clark, and Nathaniel Higginson. Another schoolmate, however, was Samuel Sewell, who graduated a year after George. In his early years after Harvard, George Burroughs served as a schoolmaster. In about 1673, George married Hannah Fisher. She was the daughter of Joshua Fisher and Mary Aldous Fisher. In 1674, George joined the Roxbury Church. That year, his first child was born. Later in 1674, George Burroughs accepted the position of minister in Falmouth, Maine, on the frontier in a place called the Eastward. This Falmouth is not to be confused with the present-day Falmouth, Maine. This one was located on Cleves Neck at Casco Bay, where the modern city of Portland now sits. At that time, Maine was governed by Massachusetts. In August 1676, during King Philip's War, George led a group to escape from Falmouth, which was attacked and destroyed by a force of Wabanaki soldiers. The group of escapees survived on an island, living off fish and berries until Massachusetts sent a vessel to rescue them. The attacks during King Philip's War caused a retreat from the Maine frontier, and George moved down to Essex County in Massachusetts proper. He settled in Salisbury, where he found a job assisting the town's minister, John Wheelwright. George even served as interim minister following Wheelwright's death in 1679. In November 1680, George landed the job of minister in Salem Village. For a time, he lived with John Putnam Sr. and his wife Rebecca, before construction of a parsonage was finished in autumn 1681. Things were definitely not all rosy for George in 1681, as his wife, Hannah Fisher Burroughs, died. While he served in the village, George faced the acrimony of supporters of the previous minister, James Bailey. By spring 1683, the village committee was no longer paying George's salary, and he moved back to Falmouth, which was being resettled. On May 3, 1683, George returned to Salem Village to receive his back pay and settle his bills. However, Captain John Putnam had him arrested for debt. Burroughs was held prisoner at Ingersoll's overnight, but the proprietor, Nathaniel Ingersoll, persuaded the Putnams to drop the charges in the morning, convincing them that the debt had in fact been settled. In about 1683, George married Sarah Ruck, the daughter of John Ruck and Hannah Spooner Ruck. In 1687, Thomas Putnam rewrote the Salem Village record book, omitting many records of George Burroughs and the controversies surrounding him and his successor, Deodat Lawson. While living in Falmouth, Sarah Ruck Burroughs died, and George took a third wife named Mary. Not much else is known about her life before George. In September 1689, Wabanaki and French soldiers attacked Falmouth again. George helped fight them back and was recognized for his bravery. In this attack, Mercy Lewis was orphaned, so she moved in with the Burroughs family, and she was about 16 at the time. In early 1690, George moved from Falmouth to Wells, Maine. His timing may have triggered more suspicion, as he left Falmouth mere months before the town was sacked in May. However, in the summer of 1691, Wells was besieged. In July and September, George Burroughs wrote appeals to Massachusetts for supplies. On January 24, 1692, the town of York, Maine, about 12 miles down the coast from Wells, was attacked, and Minister Shubael Dummer was killed, proving to New Englanders that the danger was far from over. George Burroughs wrote an account of the attack and sent it to Massachusetts leaders. He wrote about pillars of smoke, the raging of merciless flames, and the enemy shouting, shooting, hacking. On April 19, 1692, during the Salem witch hunt, Abigail Hobbs confessed that she had been made a witch at the eastward, where she had lived in Falmouth, Maine. She did not name Burroughs at this time, but would in subsequent examinations in jail. Many historians consider her confession to be a pivotal moment in the witch hunt, the moment that ultimately led to the arrest and execution of George, a Harvard-trained Puritan minister. On the 21st of April, without actually naming George Burroughs, Abigail Williams reported that she saw, quote, a little black minister, probably referred to his clothes or aspect or even his hair color rather than the color of his skin. And she said that this minister was from Casco Bay, Maine, and he'd told her that he killed his 2 wives and the wife of Deodat Lawson, who was Burroughs' successor as minister in Salem Village. Abigail said this minister had recruited 9 witches in the Casco Bay area. She spoke of his strength and ability to hold out the heaviest gun that is in Casco Bay with 1 hand, while nobody else could hold it out with 2 hands. Abigail Williams may have received her information on Casco Bay from Mercy Lewis, who was now Thomas and Ann Putnam's maid, but had previously worked for Burroughs in Falmouth, Maine on Casco Bay. Benjamin Hutchinson, noted specter fighter, happened to be with Abigail when she experienced this visitation. He asked Abigail where Burroughs stood and threw a 3-pronged iron fork at the spot she indicated. After she had what was described as a fit, she told Benjamin he had torn Burroughs' coat. On April 23rd, Abigail Hobbs' stepmother, Deliverance Hobbs, was examined in prison. She accused George Burroughs of being the preacher at a meeting of witches held on the 22nd. Burroughs allegedly encouraged the witches to gradually afflict everyone in Salem Village, not all at once. He distributed red bread and red wine like blood for the witches' communion. A week later, on April 30th, Jonathan Walcott and Thomas Putnam entered a witchcraft complaint against George Burroughs, Lydia Destin, Susanna Martin, Dorcas Hoare, Sarah Morey, and Philip English. Soon the governor and council ordered Elisha Hutchinson to arrest Burroughs in Maine, and Hutchinson forwarded the order to John Partridge, Field Marshal of New Hampshire and Maine, who arrested Burroughs in Wells, Maine, and brought him to Salem on May 4th. Sometime after George was arrested, his wife Mary left Wells with much of his property and selling much of the rest. Taking her daughter with George, Mary, she left George's other 7 children from his previous marriages to fend for themselves. The oldest child at that time was just 16 years old. A May 23rd census of prisoners says that George was transferred to Boston Jail on May 8th. However, we know that he was in Salem Village the next day, as he was examined in Ingersoll's Ordinary on May 9th by William Stoughton, Samuel Sewell, John Hathorne, and Jonathan Corwin, who would all soon sit on the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which began its operations in June. George already knew Samuel Sewell well from college and maintained a correspondence and even accepted loans from Sewell after college. He had met John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin in Maine in 1690. The examination began in private, with Samuel Parris taking notes. George was asked whether he had taken communion, and he admitted he had not in quite some time. When asked if he had baptized his children, he said only the oldest. He denied that his house in Casco had been haunted, but he admitted there were toads. And toads were common witches familiar. Then George was taken into the courtroom where the afflicted persons were waiting, and they all were grievously tortured. Susanna Sheldon said that George's two deceased wives appeared to her and told her that George had killed them. George was ordered to look at Susanna. When he turned his head back, all the afflicted persons were knocked down. Each time one of the afflicted person's testimony was to be read, that person fell into fits. Susanna Sheldon and Ann Putnam Jr. said that George had brought them the book and urged them to sign it. George said he thought the situation was an amazing and humbling providence, and he asked people to observe how the afflicted could not even say his name. During this examination, testimony of the following people was read: Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, Susanna Sheldon, Sarah Bibber, Abigail Hobbs, Deliverance Hobbs, Eliza Keyser, Simon Willard, John Brown, John Weldon, Captain John Putnam Sr., and Captain Wormwood. Though much of this testimony is not known to exist today, there is much remaining that we can go over. Sarah Bibber said that she saw and was pinched by the apparition of George Burroughs on the way to his examination, where he tormented and afflicted her and several others. Elizabeth Hubbard testified that a week before she had been approached by a little black-bearded man in blackish apparel, who told her his name was Burroughs. He asked her to sign his book, which she declined to do. The next morning he returned and bragged that he was a conjurer, which was above the rank of wizard. Later, the conjurer came around again and threatened to kill Elizabeth if she would not sign the infernal book already. Eliza Keyser recalls how he had been at Thomas Beadle's tavern when Burroughs was being held prisoner there. Captain Daniel King encouraged Eliza to go upstairs and talk with Burroughs, saying, "I believe he is a child of God, a choice child of God, and that God would clear up his innocency." Eliza declined and told King how he thought Burroughs was the chief of all the persons accused for witchcraft or the ringleader of them. Eliza was in a room with Burroughs that afternoon, though, and Burroughs did steadfastly fix eyes upon him. That night, Eliza saw very strange things appear in the chimney, I suppose a dozen of them, which seemed to me to be something like jelly that used to be in the water, and quiver with a strange motion, and then quickly disappeared soon after, which I did see a light up in the chimney about the bigness of my hand, something above the bar which quivered and shaked, and seemed to have a motion upward, upon which I called the maid, and she looking up into the chimney saw the same, and my wife looking up could not see anything. Mercy Lewis claimed George's spectre brought her the devil's book 2 days before his examination. She had been in his study in Falmouth many times and had never seen the book there, but he insisted that it had been there the whole time. He told her he had bewitched Mr. Shepherd's daughter, possibly referring to a daughter of Minister Jeremiah Shepherd of Lynn. He also said he had made Abigail Hobbs and several others witches. In a fantastic story, Mercy also claimed that on the morning of his examination, George had carried her up to an exceeding high mountain and shown her all the kingdoms of the earth, and told her that he would give them all to her if she would write in his book, and if not, he would throw her down and break her neck. She told him they were none of his to give, and she would not write if he threw her down on 100 pitchforks. Ann Putnam Jr. said she saw the apparition of George Burroughs on April 20th and cried out, "Oh, dreadful, dreadful! Here is a minister come! What, are ministers witches too? Whence come you, and what is your name? For I will complain of you, though you be a minister, if you be a wizard." George's spectre then supposedly tortured her and urged her to write in his book. This apparition of George told Anne his name, because for some reason all witches seem to volunteer their identities when they appeared as specters. This spectre told Anne he'd had 3 wives, of whom he'd murdered the first 2 with witchcraft. He said he also killed Deodat Lawson's wife Jane because she didn't want to leave Salem Village. And he's killed Deodat and Jane's child because Deodat had preached at the eastward when Dominion of New England Governor Edmund Andros had gone there with soldiers. At that time, George had also bewitched many of the soldiers to death. John Putnam Sr. and Rebecca Putnam told the court about how George Burroughs had roomed with them for 9 months back in 1680 and 1681, and did require his wife to give him a written covenant under her hand and seal that she would never reveal his secrets. They also said that all the time that said Burroughs did live at our house, he was a very sharp man to his wife, notwithstanding to our observation she was a very good and dutiful wife to him. Thomas and Edward Putnam accused George Burroughs of bewitching Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, and Elizabeth Hubbard. They said, "The aforesaid persons were most dreadfully tormented during the time of his examination, as if they would have been torn all to pieces or all their bones put out of joint, and with such tortures as no tongue can express." Susanna Sheldon testified that George Burroughs had threatened to choke her so that food would do her no good if she wouldn't sign the damned book. He later appeared to her at Ingersoll's and said he'd smothered his first wife and choked his second and also killed two of his own children. 17-year-old Mary Walcott remembered George Burroughs from his time in Salem Village and said that late in April 1692, his apparition bit, pinched, and choked her while urging her to sign in his book. She said he repeatedly tortured her until May 8th, and then he told me he would have killed his first wife and child when his wife was in travail, but he had not the power, but he kept her in the kitchen till he gave her her death's wound. Just then his two dead wives appeared in winding sheets and told her their blood cried out for vengeance against George for murdering them. Simon Willard talked about 2 feats of strength George had pulled off: holding out a large gun with one hand and carrying molasses barrels alone. Following the examination, George was sent down to Boston jail. John Arnold's account indicates he was there from May 9th until June 19th. 2 days after George's examination on May 11th, Abigail Hobbs made a statement affirming that George had brought her the book and that she had signed it. That same day, Margaret Jacobs was examined. Under intense pressure, she confessed and implicated her grandfather, George Jacobs Sr., as well as George Burroughs. May 12th, Abigail Hobbs was examined in prison. She was questioned about George Burroughs and confessed that Burroughs had her afflict people in Falmouth, Maine, when she and he had both lived there. One of these victims, Mary Lawrence, had died because she had spoken negatively about Abigail. George had brought Abigail an image of Mary, and Abigail had pricked its midsection with a thorn. Abigail had twice covenanted with the devil, once for 2 years and then for 4 more years. She'd been a witch since she was about 9 years old. She had pricked other images as well, and had even killed some boys and girls, though she did not name them. Mary Warren was also examined May 12th. Among many other things, she had a couple comments about George Burroughs, claiming that he had tried to tie the legs of John Hathorne's horse, and that he had killed one of his wives off of Cape Ann. On May 13th, Abigail Soames was examined. After this examination, Mary Warren claimed that George Burroughs appeared spectrally and bit her. Margaret Jacobs also saw Burroughs and said he told her that her grandfather, George Jacobs Sr., would hang. On May 18th, Ann Putnam Jr. testified against John Willard, claiming Willard's apparition had said George Burroughs would give him the power to kill Daniel Wilkins. June 1st, Mary Warren testified that about 2 weeks before, George Burroughs had appeared with a trumpet and sounded a call for witches to meet in Samuel Parris's pasture. On June 4th, John Stacy said that Job Tukey had said he would take George Burroughs' part. On June 19th, George was transferred out of Boston prison. On June 29th, a summary of the evidence against Sarah Good included a reference to George Burroughs preaching at a witch meeting where Deliverance Hobbs saw Sarah. On July 16th, Ann Foster said that she had seen George Burroughs at a witch meeting. On July 21st, Mary Lacey Jr. said that George Burroughs was a pretty little man who came among the witches often and sometimes appeared in the shape of a cat. On July 22nd, Richard Carrier described George Burroughs as a little man who was at witch meetings in Parris's pasture. On July 30th, Mary Toothaker also said George had preached at a witch meeting in Salem Village. August 2nd, Mary and Samuel Weber testified against George Burroughs. Mary said that in about 1685 or 1686, while the Webers were neighbors of the Burroughs family, she knew George's wife, Sarah Ruck Burroughs, well. In fact, Sarah had asked Mary to write to her, Sarah's father, John Ruck, to acquaint him with her bad situation in her marriage to George Burroughs. Mary went on to describe a strange event that had happened one night in the Burroughs household. A noise-like movement woke Sarah Burroughs that night, and she called for an enslaved woman to come investigate. The woman was blocked by an unknown force on her way up the stairs. Then something jumped down from between the chimney and the side of the house and ran downstairs. Sarah chased it down the stairs, and the enslaved woman said it was something like a white calf. Another time, while Sarah and George were lying in bed, something entered their home, stood by the bedside, breathed on Sarah. Samuel Weber said that George Burroughs had boasted about being able to carry a barrel of molasses by simply placing his fingers in the bung. George faced the grand jury on August 3rd. Previous testimony against George Burroughs was heard, as was new testimony given by Richard Carrier, Mary Lacy Sr., Mary Lacy Jr., Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Warren, Thomas Putnam, Peter Prescott, Robert Morey, and Ezekiel Cheever. After the grand jury had heard the evidence, it indicted George for afflicting Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Ann Putnam Jr. As was the case with the indictments of other suspects, those against George singled out the date of his examination as the key date in the afflictions, while generically referring to diverse other days and times as well before as after. This strategy of basing the indictments on afflictions which occurred during public court proceedings assured that there were plenty of reliable witnesses who'd seen the afflictions, though not the specters. On August 4th, witnesses John Pierce and John Lane were summoned to testify against George Burroughs, and George's body was inspected for witch marks or teats. Nothing unnatural was found. George Burroughs was tried on August 5th, 1692. A large crowd attended this trial, including New England's preeminent divine, Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather, who will appear later in the story. Witnesses William Wormwood and John, Elizabeth, Thomas, and Samuel Ruck were summoned and warned to appear the same day. Hannah Harris and Thomas Ruck testified against George Burroughs. Hannah Harris testified that she had lived in the Burroughs home in Falmouth and heard Burroughs chastise his wife for things she said while he was away. One time, Sarah Ruck Burroughs was laying in with child. After about a week, George fell out with his wife and kept her by discourse at the door till she fell sick. According to Cotton Mather in his account in The Wonders of the Invisible World, Thomas Ruck testified about a strawberry picking trip when George Burroughs acted strangely. As Thomas and his sister Sarah rode home, George walked back. He disappeared into the bushes. Somehow he beat his wife and brother-in-law home, and they found him carrying a basket of strawberries. George scolded Sarah for speaking about him to her brother while he was away. They asked how he knew what they said, and he told them he knew their thoughts, also saying, "My God makes known your thoughts unto me." In the face of all this testimony, the trial jury convicted George Burroughs. On August 11th, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. confessed that she had been at a mock sacrament at Salem Village and had seen George Burroughs, a short man. On August 19th, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, John Proctor, George Jacobs Sr., and John Willard were executed by hanging at what is now known as Proctor's Ledge on Gallows Hill in Salem. The crowd gathered to witness the executions grew restless, according to Robert Califf, who wrote of the incident 5 years later in his More Wonders of the Invisible World. According to Califf, George Burroughs made an elegant speech protesting his innocence and perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer, a feat that witches were said to be incapable of. Califf wrote that Cotton Mather addressed the crowd, many of whom had tears in their eyes. He reminded them that Burroughs had never been ordained by a full church and propounded that the devil has often been transformed into an angel of light. Apparently, this calmed the scene, and the executions went on as planned, with the bodies unceremoniously thrown into crevices in the rocky ground. Califf writes that Burroughs's clothes were removed, and an old pair of trousers of one executed was put on his lower parts. He was so put in, together with Willard and Carrier, one of his hands and his chin, and a foot of one of them being left uncovered. On August 27th, Mary Walcott said that she had seen George Burroughs at a witch meeting in Andover. On August 29th, William Barker Sr. said he knew George Burroughs was a witch, and that he and Burroughs had both attended a meeting of 105 witches in Salem Village. In the fall of 1692, Cotton Mather wrote The Wonders of the Invisible World at the behest of Governor William Phipps. In this book, Cotton included accounts of 5 trials, including the trial of George Burroughs, which was added at the assistance of colonial officials. Also that fall, Increase Mather wrote his own book, Cases of Conscience. In his postscript, he wrote that had he been one of the judges of George Burroughs, he could not have acquitted him. On September 13th, 1710, Charles Burroughs petitioned on behalf of his siblings for restitution for the unjust death of their father, George Burroughs. Charles wrote that, "We have all the reason in the world to believe he was innocent by his careful catechizing his children and upholding religion in his family and by his solemn and savory written instructions from prison." Charles estimated the total damage was in the hundreds of pounds, but he requested only 50. On September 28, 1711, a summary of amounts requested by the victims and their relatives shows this amount of 50 pounds. On October 17, 1711, the General Court of the Province of Massachusetts Bay passed an act to reverse the attainders of George Burroughs and others for witchcraft. In this act, the General Court said, "The influence and energy of the evil spirits, so great at that time, acting in and upon those who were the principal accusers and witnesses, proceeding so far as to cause a prosecution to be had of persons of known and good reputation, which caused a great dissatisfaction and a stop to be put thereunto." On December 17, 1711, Governor Joseph Dudley ordered 50 pounds to be paid to the family of George Burroughs as restitution. A document from January 3, 1712 gives the division of money paid in the Burroughs restitution, allowing just 6 of the 50 pounds to be distributed among Charles and the other children in equal shares, while the lion's share of 44 pounds went to Burroughs' former wife, Mary. A February 19, 1712 summary of receipt of payment shows that George Burroughs' widow Mary had received a disbursement, as had George's children Charles, Jeremiah, Hannah, and Rebecca. George Jr. had signed his payment over to Colonel John Appleton. On December 16, 1712, the children of George Burroughs petitioned the Restitution Committee for an additional payout, as their stepmother had received almost everything and they very little. In April 3, 1713, letter of Rebecca Burroughs Fowle requested payment of any amount remaining with the Restitution Committee. Rebecca, daughter of George Burroughs, asked that this may be done without delay, for every discourse on this melancholy subject doth but give a fresh wound to my bleeding heart. But I desire to sit down in silence. On April 8, 1713, the children of George Burroughs again petitioned for restitution. They indicated that when Mary Burroughs had left them alone, "We were turned out into a wide world to shift for ourselves, having nothing to trust into but divine providence and the generosity of friends." On May 31, 1749, Thomas Newman, Abiah Holbrook, and Elias Thomas submitted a memorial for George Burroughs and a petition to Governor William Shirley and his council. In response, the governor ordered a committee to review the request. On March 28, 1750, the three men wrote to Lieutenant Governor Spencer Phipps, adopted son of former Governor William Phipps. The petitioners informed the lieutenant governor that the committee, formed last June, had not met even once to discuss their memorial and petition. In response, Speaker of the House Thomas Hubbard ordered the committee to sit. Unfortunately, the ultimate outcome of the committee's review is unknown, but we can see that the children and descendants of George Burroughs fought for nearly 60 years to keep his memory alive. Fortunately, his memory is still kept alive today, as he is remembered in 2 memorials in Salem and 1 in Danvers, formerly Salem Village. George Burroughs was cleared in 1711 when the several convictions, judgments, and attainders against him and several others were reversed, made, and declared to be null and void to all intents, constructions, and purposes whatsoever, as if no such convictions, judgments, or attainders had ever been had or given. However, neither George nor any other Massachusetts witch trial victim ever received an apology from the province, which blamed the outbreak of witchcraft accusations on the influence and energy of the evil spirits, rather than taking human responsibility. No matter what people said about George Burroughs, he was only a man and not a wizard or conjurer. A witch by any name in those days meant a written contract with Satan was involved. George did not deserve what happened to him, and his descendants deserve peace of mind. Are you a descendant of George Burroughs? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Witch Hunt. New full episodes release every Wednesday. 15-minute episode releases on Friday, and our next victim story will be out tomorrow, Sunday. So have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.